Okay guys, so what we are going to start with now is wet on wet. Now there is wet on wet and wet in wet, two different things, okay? So wet on wet is where we are going to start off with just water, okay? So for that, I'm going to take this brush. So it's kind of like a broomstick brush, but it's a bamboo brush. That's what they're called. But yeah, they kind of look like broomsticks. So I'm just getting water, okay? And I'm going to do two different sections here to show you the two different types of wet on wet. So right now, I'm just placing water. So I've done kind of like a triangle up at the top. And from here, I think I'm going to take some of this purple. Now these have kind of sat, so they've dried out. So, load my brush with the purple. And then this is where I've had the water. So I'm just going to drop that color in there. So it was wet first. I'm going to take a little bit of this blue that I've already mixed here and mix it with this purple. So now I have like this blue violet. And I'm going to continue to drop this into the water. So the paper was wet, and then I dropped in pigment on top of the water. So that is one type of wet on wet. And then the other type, I'm going to do the same thing down here where I'm just doing plain water. So I've added that. And then this is kind of like a wash in a way, kind of like we did up here, but the paper was dry and then we just went and swiped that all the way down. This is if you want kind of a softer edge. So, but it's kind of like the application that we did with the flat wash, because you are dropping the pigment into the water that was already applied to the paper. So I'm just going to pull in some of this red. And then I'm just going to add this. So this is just where you want like a softer, more fanned out kind of layer. And those corners are going to be, and edges are going to be a lot softer, whereas this was really hard edged. Does that make sense? So you apply water first and then drop water into it, kind of like we did here, except more in like a wash kind of application. Okay, so those are both wet on wet. And then wet in wet is just when we have color already. So we're going to apply color, and then from there we're going to drop color into color. So for this, I think I'm going to start off with this yellow-green. So again, these have dried some, so I'm going in here and really activating this pigment. And then I'm going to go in and kind of like I'm just applying a wash again. So I'm just working that paint back and forth. If this ever happens, I don't know if you guys can see this very well, But do you see how I've lost like a little hair of my brush right there? I've lost one right. Oh, I picked it up. Yay! Okay. Normally, if it's there and it's just like sitting amongst your paint, your first instinct is, oh my gosh, I want to get that out of there and to like just go and, you know, grab it. But for this, it would be fine. But if it was like a painting that you'd been working on, and that happens, you lose like a little bristle of your brush, just leave it. And then later when it dries, you can pick it up. Because if you picked it up when this was wet, you would cause like your fingers would push away the pigment and then it would look all kind of ugly. So I have my green wash down there, and I'm going to drop some of this dark green and then some of that blue that's next to it into it. So this is wet and wet. You start off with wet paint, and while it's still wet, you drop it in. Now you don't have to just drop it, you can draw a line. So now I'm going to switch to this blue. Kind of looks the same. Let me go in with this super dark blue. There we go. Now we get some color change. Okay, so those are both wet on wet and then wet in wet. Okay, now if you look over here on this wet on wet, do you see how the way the paper is? This is kind of puddling right here. So if you wanted this to be darker right there, you would leave it. But right now it's puddling here and here. So if you wanted to have it more even, you just bring your brush and kind of reposition where that water is. Also, if you take your brush, we're going to talk a little bit about this later in another technique, but if you take your brush and you kind of get some of that extra water out of it, then it becomes like a little sponge and you can kind of soak up some of that extra water that's there. So like I just did there in that corner. Okay. So now we're going to move to dry brush and detail brush. So I'm going to reposition a little bit. Get some of that water off of there. Okay. So now I'm on dry brush and detail brush. So all this is pretty much what you guys had been seeing when we started doing the washes up here. It's just when your brush is dry. Now that could be like totally dry like this is. It has absolutely no moisture on it at all. Or it could be damp. So that means you have gotten your brush wet, okay? And then you have dried it off. So squeezed it and gotten all of that water out of there. That is still considered a dry brush, okay? And all that is, dry brush is, you starting off with that brush and your paper being dry. So let's just do orange. Actually, I'm gonna mix an orange because this orange is really vibrant. So I'm gonna take this orange and I'm gonna bring it over here with this yellow that I'd already kind of pulled out. And still, it's still a little orangey for me, so I'm going to take a little of this yellow and drag it over. take a little of this darker yellow here, activate it there, get some on my brush, and then mix it in here. So now obviously you're like, okay, Miss Landry, your brush was dry and now you have it wet with the paint. So how is that a dry brush? So your brush is going to be wet, but it's not going to be like sopping, okay? And so you're not going to fully fill your brush. I'm trying to get this where you can still see the palette over here. So I am going to take my other hand and I'm just going to squeeze that pigment out. Okay, like that. And then I'm going to take my brush, okay, and just pick up some. So I haven't filled my whole brush, but I've picked some up. And then I'm just going to go back and forth. So do you see how you're getting that kind of like scratchiness? Okay, so that's dry brush. So where your brush is damp or totally dry, pick up a little bit of pigment and then paint with it. Now, detail brush is a couple different things. So detail brush, your brush is going to be not sopping usually, so you want it, you know, either damp or dry like we talked about. And then you go in and it's about pressure and having super dry paper. So just like you've seen before in the wet and wet and the wet on wet, if your paper is wet starting out with just water and you drop color into it, the color is going to spread, right? So we want to make sure that with detail brush, you want your paper dry. Now you can do this on top of something you've already painted, but you want to make sure that that surface is dry. So this could be like you going back in, really putting those tiny, beautiful details of like a face or leaves or anything like that, you can definitely do. But again, you want to make sure your paper's dry, whether you're working on plain white paper or you're working over top of something you've already created. Okay, so we're gonna do some over here. So let's take a color. Let's take this because this is already wanting to just be one thing. So we'll let it be a one thing. So I'm just gonna take my brush and get it wet. And then I'm kind of placing it over here on this dry section to kind of get some of that paint off there. And then, so I don't have sopping, it's not like super, super wet. If I were to hold it like this, it wouldn't drop any color, but it does have color in it. So with this, this is where you can go in and paint like fine lines. Okay. And then you can also use your brush to make certain shapes. So you can just place this down and pick it up. So that's leaving that little shape. You can, let me switch brushes. If you take a smaller brush, let's go in with this goldeny color we'd already mixed. So, see, those could be like little flower petals. You could also do some really great dots with this brush by just going right on top. Ooh, and then you're getting like some cool textural things here, if you can see that. When the brush is really starting to dry, you could make that into some cool leaves on a tree, foliage, anything like that. This is pretty much dry, the yellow that we had painted before with the dry brush, so we could definitely go back in over that. Here's another brush, a flat brush. So I'm picking up just a little of that blue. Again, it's got paint on it, but it's not like where it would drip, okay? So with the detail brush, You can do these great straight lines. You can do like if you were doing leaves, anything like that. Or a leaf like this. Okay. You could do a thing where they call it like pushing out pigment, but basically, I'm gonna get some of this green over here. Sorry, I know you guys can't see what I'm mixing, but I'm getting just a different tone of green, different shade. So with this, you have your brush facing upward, and you just press down, press down, and then flick. So press down and then flick. By doing that, you can get these really cool like straggly bits up here at the top that can be good for grass or anything like that. I'm going to pick up some of this pigment here because it is like really a lot of color right there. And I don't want that falling and dripping all around. So all I'm doing with that, this is something that you can always do, is just literally use your brush as a pickup. So you're just sticking it down in there and it picks up some of that. So with the detail brush, you can just kind of play around, see what the different brushes do, see what you like, what you don't like. But detail dry brush, it's just where your brush isn't like totally sopping. So you haven't loaded your brush essentially. You've gotten pigment on it, but it isn't going to drip when you hold it up. Okay? Dry brush. So now, what do I want to move on to? Let's do some negative painting. The thing with negative painting is we have to start it so we can do it later. So instead of starting it like I did my brush lift out and then my magic eraser and glazing, I didn't do it yesterday, but I'm gonna do it today. So for negative painting, we want this to be light, okay? So you want this to be a very like transparent color to start off with, because we're going to be adding layers on top, okay? So the first layer, doesn't matter what colors we use, we just want them to be light. So we're going to dilute them down pretty good amount with our water. So I'm going to start off this peachy kind of color. I'm going to do this peach. Okay. And then I'm going to do like a pinky color. So I'm just going to take a little bit of that red and really dilute it. And again, just like I told you yesterday, your colors are going to dry lighter than they appear on the paper. So keep that in mind, but you still want to dilute these down quite a bit. Okay, so I have my red, or my pinky red, and my peach. So for this, you could go and do just a wash, a flat wash, where you're starting off with your dry paper, or you could do a wet application. I'm just gonna do like a wash essentially, but I'm gonna do it with these two colors. So I'm gonna start off, well, no, I'm not gonna do a wash. I'm just gonna do like some random kind of like paint strokes. So it's actually a little bit of dry brushing. So I'm just kind of going in. Okay, now I'm going to go in with that pinky color, and I didn't rinse my brush because these are going to mix together anyway. And I'm still going to leave a little bit of negative space, so I'm not going to cover like the whole thing. because I do kind of like that negative space there for interest. Okay, so that's our start for negative painting. So we're going to leave that and we're going to come back to that one later, okay? So, we can go and do some glazing right now. So, let's move on to glazing. So, we're thinking about, with glazing, all you're doing is you're taking colors that are very transparent, so they're not full pigment, they are diluted with water, and then from there you're taking other colors after the first color is dry. You're taking other colors that are also transparent, and you're just putting a layer over top of something you've already done, so you can see that that color gets darker. So I want to show you that in two different ways. So I want to show you what it looks like when you're taking the same pigment, so the same color, and taking it over and making another layer, how the pigment underneath with the new pigment on top, how that section of the paper becomes darker. And then I also want you to see the difference between layering a totally different color on top, okay? So the first one I want to show you is taking the same color. So I'm going to take this green, the yellow green that we were using before, and I'm diluting it quite a bit. And I'm pulling it out here because it was mixing with that darker green and I want the same green. Okay, so I'm taking that, and then I'm just going to do a swipe over. Okay, so do you see how that's already appearing darker? So it's just layering. So you can do that with the same color. And then I'm going to come in with this golden color that we had mixed. And again, you want it pretty diluted, so you want quite a bit of water compared to pigment in the ratio. So it is still transparent. And then I'm just going to do a layer. Okay, now I'm going to do a red. And again, I'm wanting quite a bit of water. So do you see how you still see where that green was underneath there? Okay. So now I'm going to go in with a blue. So I'm going to take this blue, just a little, because again, we want it to be a glaze, so that's lots of water compared to pigment. Okay, so that is glazing. All right. So now let's go and move down to dry brush. Let me resituate because my desk is not big enough. I don't think I said that right. I think I said dry brush and I meant to say brush lift out. So anyway, we're going to transition over to that. So brush lift out is anytime you have a surface that you've painted. It could still be wet or it could be dry, and you want to lift something out of it. So you want to lift away some of that pigment. So I'm taking my brush and I'm just getting it wet. So this is just water, okay? And I'm not getting the water off of my brush, I'm getting it off of kind of the handle. So I am dunking it and then kind of tapping it on the edge of the jar. And then to start lifting out, you just start painting a place and then having a tissue and blotting. So do you see how that's already just like taking some of that out? And you're not even rubbing really hard. You're just kind of applying it. Like I could do it in a little swirly thing. So you're just applying it. Just applying straight water and then just dabbing your tissue, or you could even use a rag on top. You can also scrub. So let's say I have this flat brush. Woo, they came apart. So you can take this and let's say I was like, oh, I really don't like this edge. So I'm working this back and forth a little bit and then I'm just blotting it. Now I'm not like really going in here and scrubbing like as hard as I can, but I am working my brush back and forth. Now as you can see, it's not getting all of it, but it is getting some of it, okay? So again, anytime you can do it a little bit like that, or you can work to where you're really trying to get more up of it, more of it up. If you have something, you can use this also if you have like a mistake on your paper and you're wanting to get rid of it. So I noticed over here, see this little guy? So he kind of splattered on here earlier today. So I don't want him there because I'm going to do straw there. So I'm just going to apply water over top of him and scrub a little and then just blot it. And he's starting to lessen, so that's good. But that's how you can kind of help with a mistake. So he's not all the way gone. See, I think you can see him a little bit, but he's pretty much gone. Especially if I wanted to paint over that later, like I wouldn't still get that glazing effect that you're still seeing here, you know. So something else I want to show you, if you get this, if you're doing this and you make a mistake, and like I have this dark purple color right now, so if I was painting and like a big drop of that went here and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want that. Well, if you work fast, you can get it and then just get rid of it and then it'll totally go away. But that's only if it's wet, okay? So keep that in mind. A lot of people I know, I've seen, they'll start to paint and something like that will happen and they'll think, oh my gosh, the whole thing's ruined. No, if you get it right then, you can usually get all of it up and it doesn't even matter. So, let me see. I think that is all we're going to do today. So, yeah. All right. So we got wet on wet, wet in wet, dry brush and detail brush. We started our negative painting here. And then our glazing we worked on and our brush lift out. Okay? Yeah. So we'll move on again tomorrow. Okay, guys? All right. Yay!